Okay, welcome everybody to Conversation from Culture. Today we have a very special guest, David Sauvage, also known as the Empath. And definitely the name provokes everyone to ask a question about what is an empath and why should we talk about empathy?
Is that my question? Well, what is an
Yes.
empath and why should we talk about empathy?
Yeah,
Oh, well, first, thanks for having me. This is cool. Can I ask you a question, Maria, before I answer your question?
please.
What is your interest in empathy and empaths?
I'm interested in emotions and feelings and feeling my emotions. And now, as I'm telling you this, I'm wondering if feelings and emotions are the same thing.
Hmm. Well, we use the words interchangeably, so I think it's okay to think of them as the same thing. But technically, an emotion is a state of being, and a feeling is a physiological experience. So sad is a way of being, but we can also feel the feeling of sadness, like maybe the sadness is in our chest or in our face, but the terms can be used interchangeably. You're not doing anything wrong by saying a feeling is an emotion is a feeling. I would say all emotions are feelings, but not our feelings are emotions. Um, and an empath, to go back to your question, empath, as I use the term, is somebody who feels the emotion of others. An empath, as I use the term, is somebody who feels the emotions of others. So if somebody is sad in front of me, I might feel their sadness in my own body, have the experience of being sad. That's how I use the term empath. So it can be used in other ways. It could mean somebody who's hypersensitive. It can mean somebody who has a lot of intuition. The word can be used in all these ways, and they're all perfectly fine ways of using the word. And empathy, why is empathy important? It's not that I'm into empathy because it's important. I'm into empathy because I'm good at it. And and so, like anybody who has a skill, I've cultivated it and practiced it, and it's my jam. But I'm not sure it's. I mean, like, I wouldn't want to say it's more important than music or math or any other form of activity. Um, but I guess we could say about empathy is uh, empathy is a way of bridging the gap between people. Empathy is a way of bridging the gap between people. If I truly understand what you're going through, then we are more able to connect authentically. And I'm able to help meet your needs, and you're able to help meet my needs. And we're moving toward a more compassionate world together.
Beautiful. But why feelings are so complex sometimes? What makes it stagnate and difficult to deal with, and people pay attention more to intellectual knowledge than feelings in order to accomplish what you just said?
Um, feelings, I don't know if feelings at their core are difficult. Um, like, I don't think children have trouble with feeling their feelings. I think as we get older, we get manipulated out of our feelings or confused out of our feelings, and we're told that our feelings aren't okay in some way or form. So we learn that we have to hide them. And sometimes that means feeling what we're feeling and hiding it to the outside world, which is sad. But sometimes it means even hiding it from ourselves. So we start to confuse ourselves about what we're feeling in order to fit in or in order to get something done. And then all these different emotions start stacking up against each other or with each other, and we can't separate them out because we're not in touch anymore. I think the core reason that it's so hard to engage in feelings these days is because we don't prioritize it culturally. If I go into a room and say, I have a goal, help me, 100 people will raise their hand and say, I want to help you with the goal. If I say, I'm having a feeling and I really want to be held and understood, a few people will reach out and engage. But it's a much different kind of need, and it isn't met as much in the culture.
So, can I barge in for a second here, Maria?
Yeah, sure.
So then, how would you tell the difference between sympathy and empathy? That's a two-part question here. So the first part is, what would be the difference between sympathy and empathy? And then the second one is, if you're in touch with other people's suffering, then how do you keep yourself from experiencing a sort of compassion fatigue, or having that be more of a burden than actual strength? Because of course I acknowledge the importance of empathy, um, in the sense of like being attuned to what other people might need, um, um, or just being just mere intelligent in a sense, relationship wise. But then on the other side of the spectrum, there's always, besides people who are devoid of it, I would say people um, who might complain or be concerned with the possibility of that compassion fatigue, or having been surrounded by people who are suffering, or so forth.
Awesome questions. So the first one, sympathy is caring. Sympathy versus empathy. Sympathy is caring about somebody. You care about their state. You want them. See, sympathy is, I care about you. I don't know much about sympathy, but I care about you. I want you to do better. I feel for you. And empathy is more like, I feel as you. I really understand what it's like to be you. So empathy is when you really understand what it's like to be another human. We all know that feeling when somebody gets us. Oh, they got us. That's a very satisfying feeling. That's when somebody's had empathy for us. And your second question, how do I prevent compassion fatigue? Well, there's the phrase compassion fatigue brings up two different possible definitions. And the first is the one I'm more familiar with, which is you can get burned out merely by feeling other people's feelings all the time. Like your nervous system can actually get shot. This happens to a lot of psychologists and teachers and nurses and anyone who's used to dealing with people in high emotional intensity environments on a regular basis. And so the way to prevent that, it's not an easy answer. First of all, to acknowledge that if you're sensitive to other people's emotions and you're spending time with people who are having a lot of them, you're going to burn out, and just to accept that that's probably going to happen. Secondly, it's the way out of it is to prioritize your own needs, which is really hard. And that means that if you can only handle being around people who are having intense emotions for X amount of time before you start shutting down, you want to know that and then set boundaries, which is not easy. I mean, like, it's not easy. There's a lot of reasons why it's hard to set boundaries. And then then there are a lot of energetic tricks you can do where, for instance, I will release everything that I've picked up. Like, I'll envision all the stuff I've picked up and imagine moving it through my whole body. Or I will imagine giving all the stuff I've picked up back to the person who gave it to me. And a million other things like that. Sorry about my throat. And then the other form of compassion fatigue is more the way the phrase sounds, when you simply get tired about caring about people. And that tends to happen when you don't have your own needs met. So if you feel full and overjoyed then it's really easy to care about people. But if you feel depleted and your needs aren't being met and nobody cares about you, then you might resent people who are wanting your compassion, or you might resent people for whom you'd otherwise feel compassion because you don't have your own needs met.
Mm.
Can I ask a question? David, I'm sorry for coming in late. I was thinking about the whole concept of being an empath, and it made me think about the psychologist William Gardner, the multiple intelligence theory, where he's talking about. So William Gardner in 1983, he came up with this idea that, well, for him back then, it was that humans have 7 different types of intelligence. You know, mathematical, logical, musical intelligence, spatial intelligence, and 2 of them were intrapersonal and interpersonal intelligence, right? And so being empathetic made me think about that interpersonal intelligence, the ability to read others. And so I'm kind of curious your take on how much of being an empath is spiritual and how much of it is neurological. I'm kind of curious of your take on, is it 100% one or the other? Is it a mix?
What do you mean by spiritual?
I know a few people who label themselves as empaths, and they see it strictly as like a spiritual or a supernatural experience, right? Where they're like, this is beyond what humans are capable of, but I'm reading your emotions because our spirits are connected to each other. So that's like within their spiritual beliefs, versus, back to, Gardner, who would say that it's all neurological. It's all in the brain. It's just a particular type of intelligence. So just curious of your take on those 2 ideas.
Well, I think underpinning your question is a philosophical premise that I'm not sure I accept, which is that there's a line we can draw between the physical and the spiritual, or that like, I don't believe that the brain is the seat of consciousness, or that I believe that the brain is more like a radio that picks up on consciousness. And science goes as far as it goes today, but eventually I just think it keeps going, and it will integrate more and more of what we think of as spiritual.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I don't think anything in my abilities or any other empath's abilities or your abilities or our abilities is fundamentally beyond our capacity to understand, but it might be beyond current science's ability to explain. So
yeah, no, I mean, I hear what you're saying. In terms, like, someone could say that they have a 6th sense.
Yeah.
And we don't have, science is not there to step in to explain what's the process of that. And so we as humans, we love absolutes. We'll fill that with other things. And I'm with you on that. That there's a lot of things spiritual that science hasn't caught up with, and sometimes science does catch up in that regard. So.
And I think it will.
Mm-hmm.
I think it will. So I think it's spiritual and neurological, and that there's no divide.
Okay, all right. I'm with you, but I'm wondering your take on it. Because I consider myself to be very empathetic as well. I can read other people pretty well, but and actually a second question that I was going to ask you is about that intrapersonal intelligence. You were talking about being a child. Well, not you specifically, but like children being children, and how we're often encouraged to not listen to our feelings and emotions. And I'm kind of curious, how do you struggle with intrapersonal intelligence, like knowing how you feel, knowing exactly how you feel in a given moment? Does it come to you in the same way that it comes when you're in front of other people and you can read what they're feeling? Can you read your own feelings with the same strength?
Yes, and I think the 2 are really connected.
Sure.
At least in the physical sense. my ability to feel what other people are feeling is directly connected to my ability to feel my own feelings. So if I can't recognize the difference between sadness and despair in my own body, then I can't recognize it in somebody else, at least physically. I might be able to recognize it visually or some other way. So my own emotional self-awareness is super high, with a few really interesting exceptions. I have a hard time with fear. I have a hard time feeling fear. I don't have a healthy relationship with fear, but almost every other emotion I can feel fully in great gradations.
Question. So would you say your ability to feel an emotion or the other, or your relationship with that emotion, is that related to your ability to label it, or is it something that is trained?
Labeling probably comes second. It's more just like it's largely trained and partly innate, but it's no different than like if you just stop now and you just go, how am I feeling? And you could even just do it physically. How am I feeling? And then I can feel this thin layer that feels slightly fluid around my chest. I have a touch of heaviness here. My throat is grovelly. There's a little bit of wooziness in my eyes. I'm pretty attuned. Emotionally, it's pretty neutral in here. Maybe there's a touch of melancholy hanging over me that's not a result of this conversation, that I can feel is just with me. So I'm just feeling all that, and that's it. That's the practice. There you have it. And we can, it's always available to us. I probably do it more than most, but that's all there is to it.
So what I'm hearing you say is that that language comes into play to a certain extent, and to the other is that, you know, taking the time to check every once in a while to see what's happening, and that in that sense it's trainable, and it's a practice. I hear you say.
Yeah, and I would say language comes second. I would say like the ability to articulate it is much less important than the ability to feel it.
Got it. Yeah, thank you.
Do you feel it in your body, David?
Yeah.
And how about, I've heard before people saying how the mind can intervene and prevent you from feeling it fully, and the nuances about sensations and bodily feelings. And some people have called it ego, this intervention of the mind into that process of feeling your feelings in your body. And I wanted to ask you about this distinction. And it came up in another conversation we were having last week about mind and body connection. I don't know if it's just directly related, but yeah. So how about this idea of the ego and this idea of ego death that we hear a lot these days as well?
You're bringing a lot of concepts into one question. The mind or the ego or whatever, some other force might need you to believe things about your feelings that aren't true, and tell you that you're feeling things you're not, to achieve a certain goal or to fit in. So, for instance, we often pretend how we're feeling. If somebody says, "Are you okay?" and you're really not okay, but you don't feel safe sharing that you're not okay with the person who asked, you might not be able to say to yourself, "I'm not okay, but I don't feel safe sharing it." You might say to yourself, "I am okay. Yeah, I'm okay," in order to avoid the discomfort of the dynamic. So that's, I don't know if I would call that ego, but that's a kind of protection we put up. We lie to ourselves about what we're feeling in order to feel safe. And that's common and normal and happens all the time, every day, all day. So that's where the mind can get in. And you know, where ego really tells people how they're feeling, people have often have a vision for how they ought to be feeling, and then they will either try to will themselves into feeling that way, or worse, they will convince themselves that they feel that way, thinking that merely by convincing themselves they feel that way, that will change the way they feel, when all now they really feel is confused and disconnected, but they are so afraid that they're not what they are. Tony Robbins is a master of this game. He's very much about how to trick your nervous system into believing you're somewhere that you're not, in order to inflate into a higher state. And to some degree, that stuff's okay, and it can work. But that to me is ego getting in the way of your natural system. So ego death is a whole nother game. Ego death is I guess I would define it as the death of a sense of I. The death of a sense of I.
I can barge in. So there's a concept that goes around that is, if you don't feel your emotions fully, then they get repressed. That's one side of the story. On the other side, they say that if some emotions are expressed, like anger, you can exacerbate them, or potentiate them. So I just wanted to get your take on that from a practical point of view. So let's say I feel anger, for example, and I know that it may not be the healthiest to express it, but then I also find that it's, say, not a pleasant feeling. So then how can I tell whether I'm repressing it or whether I'm feeling it on one side? And then should I actually repress an emotion, then what would be a way to release it later on?
I love these practical emotional questions. They're my favorite. And I like the mechanics of them. It's a big distinction to make first between feeling an emotion and expressing it. So if you take anger, your example, something causes anger to rise up in you. Now, unhealthy is, I'm not feeling anger. I don't want to feel anger. Put that away. That's unhealthy. Healthy is, I'm feeling so angry right now. Then further than that, punching somebody in the face. I don't know if that's healthy or unhealthy, but it's not helpful. So the emotions are healthy to feel unless they are unbearable. Emotions are healthy to feel unless they are unbearable. That's my rule. But the unless they are unbearable is important, because you don't want to force yourself to feel something that you can't withstand. That's unhealthy and risks being self-abuse. And the reason why an emotion is unbearable is because there's trauma there. So, for instance, if every time you got angry, your mom yelled at you and made you feel horrible, then when you feel anger, that might be overwhelming to you. And you shouldn't just go, I need to feel this. I got to feel. You'll start spinning and you might have a panic attack or something. So take into account what your limits are too. But if you can deal with an emotion, you want to deal with an emotion. But if you can't deal with an emotion, you want help dealing with that emotion. That help you?
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And to add to that, so should an emotion be unbearable, or should someone not be trained to feel it or label it or whatnot? Do you believe it does get repressed or get strapped in the body? And do you think there's a way to release that somehow in the future?
Yeah. I mean, any emotion, like, think about it like there are these two parallel worlds, the conscious life and the unconscious life. And everything that's happening to you is causing some level of emotional reaction in us. Now, most of that is really trivial and just like washes right through and doesn't matter. But sometimes you have something that really causes an intense emotional reaction. And if we are not conscious of it and with it and allow it, or we push it away, it just stays. It's in the body like an echo. And And the way to release those trapped emotions is by developing a healthy relationship to the emotions that are coming up. You don't necessarily have to go backward in time and go, oh, I need to deal with that emotion I repressed. If you open up the faucet in a healthy way, the old emotions will eventually come out.
That's great. That's good stuff. Yeah.
Do you think it's important to understand those emotions in those moments, or to understand the root of those emotions in those moments?
It can be soothing to understand the root of those emotions, and that's worth something. So if you find yourself suddenly, to use Ali's example, filled with anger, and you don't know why, then that will be disorienting. You will be feeling rage and disorientation, and that's much less pleasant than if you understand, oh, I'm angry because that person did this. Now at least you're just feeling rage.
Right.
So the context, when you understand yourself, you're going to feel better. Just like if somebody else understands you, you feel better. But for the emotion to flow, you don't need to understand it. For the emotion to flow, you don't need to understand it. It's enough to feel it. Now, if the emotion is an extremely unpleasant one and it's happening on a regular basis and you don't understand it, I personally would want to know what's going on and really track what's happening, because that's something that wants to be healed.
Sometimes I would like to know, because I mean, I was thinking about trauma when I was asking about that, and sometimes we don't remember our traumas, but we can feel the feeling of it.
Yeah.
And we can feel the emotion tied to it. And me personally, I have a thing where like I want to like be able to see the trauma detail for detail in order to make sense of what I'm feeling, and I'm wondering if that work is even worth it.
Go the other way around, which means, what I mean by that is, the feelings are memories of the trauma.
Right.
They're just not visual. And so the more you get into the feeling of it, again, to the extent that you can bear it, the more you get into the feeling of it, the more likely the story will emerge through that. You don't have to go story first. You can go feeling first, and it'll lead to the story. And it is definitely not necessary to understand the trauma that happened to you in order to heal it. It's definitely not necessary. It is only necessary to process the emotions associated with the trauma, whether or not you remember what happened.
Very nice. Thank you.
Yeah.
This is very helpful. I think you're helping a lot of people, David, with your insights, I'm sure. And the more people will hear it and be benefited from it. And I also want to mention that you have workshops that people can go on your website and find those workshops. I think you're having them every other Thursday or something like that. And especially, and also to mention that you have workshops for empaths as well, right? And one of those workshops was about healthy communication. And you mentioned earlier how sometimes you don't want to say to somebody, I don't feel comfortable sharing this feeling with you, so I'm going to repress my feelings. So that's kind of like unhealthy communication. So how would you become more healthy in how you communicate your ideas and feelings to other people?
Well, my standard line here, which is good, is healthy communication is about authentically expressing your inner experience in such a way that the other person understands. And it's a really high bar. It's not easy to do, but it's both parts: authentically communicating your inner experience and such that the other person understands. So both, taking into account your truth and their capacity to understand you. That's healthy communication. Now, sometimes it's unsafe to communicate what you're authentically feeling. If you're really angry at someone and you are afraid that saying you're angry at them will make them freak out, then you might not want to say you're angry at them. In which case, the healthy thing to do would be to say, hey, I'm feeling a lot of things right now, but I don't feel safe sharing. I'll share with you later. So you want to develop as honest a relationship with your own experience as possible, and then sharing that with others to the extent that it's safe. And if it's not safe, you want to acknowledge that it's not safe. That's my standard thought on healthy communication. Simple, but not easy.
Guys, we have 6 more minutes before the session closes. So if you have any questions, you can ask them now.
I mean, my question, I guess, would be how to expound on this amazing knowledge that we just received. If there's any further reading we can do.
Oh, you're really sweet. Let's see. I don't know. I wish there were.
You mentioned your website.
Yeah, I do. I'm doing classes on Thursday at 8 p.m. So every Thursday at 8 p.m. You can find it on empath.nyc. Or you can just put your email in the chat, make it easier, and I'll add you to my mailing list.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I'm complete, so thank you.
Thank you, Ali.
Natalia? Hi.
Ooh, thank you guys. This is next level stuff, so I'm very like in my study zone. That's what came through so far, and I'll be going through this way of basically communicating through visuals and this energetical cleaning, because the depth of the work that we do here is truly remarkable and historical, and yeah, I'm very excited to what's to come as a collective result of this circle kind of work, yet having a speaker like David to come in. Yeah, it's just so much gratitude. Thank you, Maria, for getting us together.
Natalia is definitely another empath in the room. Okay, guys, thank you so much. David, is there anything else you want to share with the audience before we close it off?
No, I'm grateful for so thank you guys, Ali and Trevor and Maria, for your great questions, and Natalia and Eleni for hanging out and listening. I really appreciate it.
Great.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeleni, thank you for joining. You guys, Maria, Yeleni, meet.
Hi. We'll meet. I think I've seen your name before, and I've seen you around. Probably it was like She's birthday.
She's in the circles.
Yeah.
Yes, I love you guys. Thank you. And nice to meet you, Ali and Trevor. Nice to see you.
Nice to meet you, Natalia.
Nice to see you. Nice to meet you guys.
Bye, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Have a good night.
Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. Take care.